Have it. That's a shame. Maybe I don't have it. It's a slide of, so for Futurama, there's this kind of like a galactic commander bro character called Zap Brannigan, and he's standing there at the unveiling of some like Martian infrastructure they built, and it's been kind of reworded as a meme, and it says something to the effect of, "We chose to build a Bitcoin mine on the moon not because it was easy or profitable, but because it's a reinforcement of our kind of collective will, because we can." And that, I think, speaks to the kind of paperclip mindset.
Mm-hmm. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started now. My name is Joel Toms, and I'm part-time studio lecturer in the MA Art and Ecology. And I'm standing in for Suhail this term for the RPG talks. And this is the augmentation series, as you know. And it's been proclaimed that the great battle of our time is the battle for ownership of the digital footprints that make up our lives. And the reach of state and corporations into our lives via cards and apps has never been greater, and social life becomes a direct input to centralized techno-capitalist production. The series Augmentation is looking at how digital augmentation is changing every aspect of life on Earth. And there's this new world order.
I think we call that a mic drop.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I don't know. So yeah, we were talking about environmentalization, cyberneticization, techno-ecologies, as we do. And we've been talking about new world orders and their disturbing consequences for freedom, justice, and power. Indeed, for the quality of human life and mental health. And increasingly, artists and cultural institutions, researchers are intervening in and developing new tactics, skills, and complex transdisciplinary counter-assemblages to engage the augmenting strata of this condition. So this theme is a way to address some of the long-term consequences of the move to the online art model, accelerated by lockdown and COVID-19 and its weaponization. And so far, we've heard from Eva Yager and Victoria Ivanova, Wassim Alsindi, who is with us again today. And last week, we heard from Anna Engelhardt. So today, we'll hear again from Wassim and Janna Klarre Bekker on dissensus and decentralization. So the usual format is the speakers will present a fairly conversational talk for about 40 minutes, and then we have 20 to 30 minutes for discussion, where Maria and I can help field your questions to the speakers. Our final talk in the series is next week, 6th of June, same time, same place. And we'll hear from the US-based Xiaowai Wang and her talk, Accounting for Accountability in Rural China. Another reminder to put your name, course, and year in the chat box so we can note your attendance for the register. And as you develop questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. In Dissentralisation Theater, Alsindi and Bekker ask, what happened to the once burgeoning peer-to-peer and open source software movements? With half of the internet controlled by a handful of techno-feudalists, we need horizontal organization and technology more than ever. What we seem to have instead, perhaps even as a substitute, is blockchain, which ties peer consensus and distributed architecture with economic incentives. What have we gained and what has been lost in this paradigm shift? What is decentralization actually? Janna Klarre Bekker speaks, writes, and does research on questions of authority, economics, and control and power in decentralized technologies. She's Chief Strategy Officer at crypto-incentivized privacy system NIM. I think that's pronounced right.
NIM.
Sorry, how is it?
NIM.
NIM. Okay,
NYM,
sorry.
yeah.
NYM. She's also a fellow at the Weizenbaum Institute and occasional advisor to the European Commission on Decentralized Technologies. Formerly a researcher at Durham University's Geography Department, working on the political economies of crypto economics. She completed a PhD titled Disassembling the Trust Machine, 3 Cuts on the Political Matter of Blockchain. That was in 2019. She's the author also of the Satoshi Hippocratic Oath for Blockchain Developers and co-author of the White Paper with Ignota Books, a republishing and historical contextualization of the Bitcoin White Paper. And she's contributor to the Money Lab Reader, Artist Rethinking the Blockchain, Shum, and Agorism in the 21st Century. She's based in London and Berlin and takes active part in European cultural, policy, and industry debates on blockchain, data politics, and the development of decentralized network technologies. And Wassim Alsindi is the host and creative director of the OX Salon in Berlin, a collective which critically interrogates digital culture through discourse events and residencies, producing lore, theory, games, and visual art. A veteran of the time chain, Wassim specializes in conceptual design and philosophy of peer-to-peer systems, on which he writes, speaks, and teaches. He holds an editorial column at MIT Computational Law Report and co-founded MIT's Crypto Economic Systems Journal and Conference Series. Wassim has curated arts festivals, led a sculptural engineering laboratory, and published experimental music, improvisatory theater, poetry, and speculative scripture. Building upon research specializations in the natural sciences, Wassim holds a PhD in ultra-fast photophysics from the University of Nottingham, alongside degrees in chemistry, astrophysics, and finance. So with that, I would like to leave it to y'all.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction.
Yeah, thanks very much, y'all. Jaya, what do you think? Should we read out the text that we prepared, the initial statement, as a jumping off
Yeah,
point?
let's do that. We can start there.
I mean, maybe you want to take it in turns. Why don't you go first and I'll do the second one?
Decentralization theater. What happened to the once burgeoning peer-to-peer and open source software movements? With half of the internet controlled by a handful of technofeudalists. Wait, Joel read this out already, didn't you?
Yeah.
Kind of.
Okay, then we don't need to read it.
Yeah, let's dive into the title. Decentralization theater, which Wassim sent over to me. And I take that as an excellent welcome, an excellent invitation for a great conversation. Very happy to be here. More specifically, I'm very happy to put the dissensus in decentralization, or put the dis into decentralization, and play the role in this theater of a little bit the devil's advocate. I've kind of been toying with the idea of writing a text called Against Decentralization, just because I feel like the term has become some kind of suffocating, all-encompassing good, in a way that hides many of its contradictory meanings and many of its more destructive side effects. So that's kind of what I'm hoping we can get into a little bit in this conversation. Maybe I could start off with the discussing a little bit the use of the term dissensus. I don't know, what do you think, Wassim? Where the word comes from, you know? I can't hear what you're saying, by the way. Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, maybe say something about consensus and then, dissensus as well.
Yeah, okay. So I started to use the word dissensus when I was writing my PhD, and very much in reaction to the idea of a consensus algorithm. Why did that become such a necessary move to make was a little bit because the idea of the consensus algorithm started to become this form of narrative of having finally resolved the problem of politics, namely the problem of dissensus, namely how do we come to agreement in large groups of people around things that, around some fundamental differences. And here we had, the kind of consensus machine, the consensus algorithm came about, which was, initially in Bitcoin through, which was the algorithm of the Bitcoin ledger. And, the kind of story, the overall narrative went a little bit something like this. Decentralization, namely a decentralized network, would solve the problem of power. No single node would have complete power. And then the proof of work consensus algorithm would solve the problem of any kind of disagreement between nodes in the network. And because everything was coded in open source transparent code, this would be a fair system. Everyone could see the rules and engage on a voluntary basis. And so, this kind of very elegant machinic solution to the problem, to the social problem of dissensus, the problem of politics, or framed politics as a problem to be solved, let's say. So I wanted to kind of throw a spanner in that works, and started to implement started to kind of introduce the term of dissensus into the space. And the timing of that was quite good, because in actual fact, what happened was dissensus broke out around the very consensus algorithm itself. In the case of blockchain, we saw that with the initial Bitcoin scaling conflict. And in the case of Ethereum, we saw that with the early DAO hack, which for those of you who've been following this space a little bit might be familiar with those stories. But essentially what happened in both of those scenarios was people realized that the very kind of what was supposed to be a kind of objective machine, an objective logic of a kind of protocol, it turned out that actually people write the protocol to start off with, and maybe there's, in fact, not consensus around how the protocol was initially written. And so it opened up the problem of politics once again, and it opened up the question of governance within the kind of technological realm and within the realm of decentralization. So yeah, I'm bringing the dissensus to the concept of decentralization, and hoping that we can go through a little bit of a historical arc, maybe going a little bit pre-blockchain, and looking at some of the early histories of peer-to-peer and some of the earlier promises of decentralization.
Sounds great. One thing that really came to my mind, which I don't want to, I mean, like if we're going to go before Bitcoin, I shouldn't go elaborate too much into it. But when Bitcoin was announced on the so-called cypherpunks mailing list in late 2008, there was a kind of a long discussion on there about the merits of this idea. And there was a reply that was actually made off the mailing list that Satoshi replied back onto the mailing, appended it to a reply on the mailing list, which just from an anonymous poster that just said, "You will not find an answer to political problems through cryptography." I think that's a pretty interesting lesson that we may or may not have heeded in the intervening decades.
Absolutely.
So where should we start, Jaya?
Let's have a look at what comes next in the slides.
So that's, our blurbs. I think this is kind of what we were talking about, this kind of like knotted nature of decentralization. But this is quite framed towards the blockchain. So I wonder if you want to come back to that.
I think we can look at this. We can work through this slide a little bit. What do you think?
Sure. So one thing I always try to start with is like, we talked about how decentralization is this kind of like, considered to be this kind of, good, this virtue. I always kind of think of it as an ideal, as some kind of like, poetic ideal, that we're always kind of striving for this thing, like we're striving to be good and just and honest and fair. And so it kind of gets lumped in, or kind of implicitly lumped in etymologically, or like rather semantically, with those kinds of things. But it's a very hard thing to actually, decentralization itself, it's a very hard concept or notion to define or to parameterize. Many people have tried, and usually the chance that the ways that we do it are using kind of like, whatever empirical metrics, which don't tell complete stories or can be kind of gerrymandered. But I always like to point towards decentralization not being this binary thing that you've either got or you haven't. It's very much this kind of spectral characteristic. Do you want to talk about this, the image on the right? Should we talk about where the term came from?
let's talk a little bit about where the term comes from, because I think that the origins of the term speaks exactly to this kind of elusive ideal, right? And the origins here are political, right? It comes from, the French Revolution, de Tocqueville, and it creates this kind of a political imaginary and a social imaginary of let's say, empowerment for everybody, right? Of decentralizing power where it was otherwise centralized, right? And I think that kind of imaginary filters down through the imaginaries around the kind of technological stack. So it's like when, it basically creates this assumption that if you create decentralized technology, then you will also inherently somehow bring about this kind of decentralized political reality. And what we see in how things actually play out, that's never quite the case. But what I also noticed was, if decentralization, first kind of became a thing around the French Revolution, the concept of dissensus, in fact, became a thing during a different French Revolution, namely May 68. And this was where the political philosopher Jacques Rancière started to think through the nature of the political as different from what he calls the police or politics. And it's actually a distinction that another political philosopher or political thinker, Chantal Mouffe, also draws that distinction. So what do they mean by that? And what do we mean when we say dissensus? So here, dissensus, as Rancière was seeing it in May 68, was the eruption of a form of disagreement or form of differences that could not be captured within the kind of otherwise legitimate arena of politics, right? So in 1968, politics was kind of considered something that was the realm of parliament. You would have parties working it out between them within a certain kind of legitimate forum. But what Rancière was trying to articulate was that what was happening in the streets in 1968 was in fact the political. So where politics within the realm of the parliamentary legitimate working out of differences was something that he would equate that with the police. It was like the existing order of things, or the existing, what he calls the distribution of the sensible, what is considered sensible within a certain organizational or a certain societal arrangement. What happens when you have dissensus is you have the eruption of difference onto the stage and making itself heard, forcing a renegotiation of what's considered sensible, and forcing a renegotiation of the way that politics is worked out in the first place. And so, why is this important? Because, when we look at the attempts to kind of organize consensus, whether it's through, kind of a political bureaucracy with political institutions, or whether it's through a technological protocol, the very means through which we decide that differences should be worked out can in fact become a new site for dissensus, can in fact become a new site for the working out of differences. And I think what this also points to is, these different layers that we're looking at here in the diagram, right? Where it's like, when we think through the concept of decentralization, it becomes so important to actually, kind of have an imagination in our mind that is exactly multi-layered, where it's like decentralization at the protocol layer, does not necessarily have the effect of decentralization on the monetary layer, or on the social and political layer, and in actual fact it can do the opposite, right? So this kind of layered understanding of decentralization. That's my version of talking through this slide, Wassim, but you also created this slide, so what's your version of talking through it?
I mean, I find it, I know that the theme of today is dissensus, but I find it hard to disagree with you, Jaya, so we're going to have to be a bit more polarizing. But yeah, no, I think taking this layered approach is very sensible. And this diagram was something I made in an article a few years ago for Indomesh, but it was taken from a model that Vitalik Buterin, the co-founder of Ethereum, made in an article called The Meaning of Decentralization, I think in 17 or 18, where he's kind of making a lot of these points, saying that we can't have like full decentralization, because if you think about all of these different kind of elements that we've got, the logical part has to be centralized. We have to have, like in blockchain, this is talking about blockchain here, we need like one global master ledger that everybody else agrees on, And that's kind of like, that is the bedrock on which all of that stuff is built. And so if you
Which
want global,
is Vitalik's vision, right? But then you
yes,
exactly have other blockchain systems that came about that, you know, where you have ecosystems of blockchains and where the single ledger is exactly not the point, right?
yeah, indeed, that's one of the schisms that led to a lot of the Ethereum co-founders leaving and making their own projects, because they wanted these more flatter ecosystem of blockchain kind of architectures, whereas some of them, like Ethereum, the new Ethereum that's about to launch, is kind of like a one chain to rule them all kind of thing.
But I think, so for me, again, why, you know, I want to bring the dissensus to the table a little bit here again. One thing I keep wondering is, what exactly are we trying to achieve with decentralization, right? And also, at what point are we going to start to look seriously at the failures of the attempts over and over and over again of decentralization, both in the technical realm and in the political realm, right? And when, you know, at what point can we start to gather together these lessons? And I think one of the things that I'm starting to get not concerned about, but an itch that I have when I see how the kind of current iteration of decentralization is playing out, is that it really is forcing this kind of quite neoliberal or like hyper individualized understanding of the world, where, you know, and I think it's a kind of effect of almost like the node vector diagram, right? Where it's like each of us are nodes, and those nodes are somehow kind of self-contained. And then we kind of like ping each other every once in a while, you know, through some kind of like pre-existing, you know, protocol. But you look at kind of these, you know, what these different nodes actually represent, or what is being attempted to be built in a lot of decentralized systems. And what we see is like this idea of, you know, that in order to decentralize power, which tends to be the kind of underlying driver, right? The dream here, right? It's like, how can we decentralize power? Can we kind of empower all of us to become, you know, to somehow no longer be, you know, no longer be under the power of someone else, but really kind of, then what happens in that moment is we start to kind of assume that means everybody should be their own bank, and should be their own state, and should be their own church, and should be their own police, you know. And you see that play out over and over and over again, like in the detail, right? Like you see people in this space arguing for, you know, 3D printed guns because we should all be our own police, you know. It argues for, you know, the kind of the ability for each of us to write our own rules, the ability for each of us to run our own chains, to start our own tokens, you know.
Can I jump in, Jaya? Because I've got a great example here, which is, gosh, what's the company called? Defense Distributed. It's not the biggest one anymore, but they used to be one of the biggest companies that would sell 3D print schematics of firearms for you to print at home. An extremely controversial company. It was a very, very early Bitcoin guy that did that. And so you can kind of see this kind of like techno-libertarian freedom narrative is really entwined with a lot of these kind of pseudo-monetary technologies.
Yeah. And I wonder when we're going to get over that, right? When are we going to kind of like push through to a different kind of vision, or maybe just drop the idea of decentralization altogether, because there's problems with that concept, right? And I think
it's, as a narrative tool, it seems to work. And I think we're getting at that. It seems to drive these things forwards. One of the things I like to think of, when we're talking about this neoliberal myth of the sovereign individual, I frame it a bit differently, where I think of, because we're kind of replacing a lot of kind of decision-making systems with markets. That's ultimately what blockchain logics lead us to, blockchain economics lead us to. So it's kind of like a neoliberal deterritorialization. We're just kind of like taking out all the structures, replacing them with markets, because it's simpler, but it doesn't mean it's fairer or it's more inclusive or it's, you know.
Yeah, when you start reading the protocols, it's far from simpler. And you start looking into the kind of the financial mechanisms that are being developed, it's staggering in its complexity.
Yeah, and we're the ones that understand the protocols. So there's a whole bunch of other people that don't understand them, and who's got the advantage? I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think the, you know, the kind of markets and computation have an interesting intertwined history, actually, you know, and in many ways, both are this kind of and intertwined history with the concept of decentralization. So the concept of decentralization has been around through, you know, for many years in economic history and for many years in computational history, right? And somehow there is an underlying, you know, and I, of course, this is not the case for all computational theory, but in a kind of strong strand of it, there is this kind of like underlying assumption of the neutrality of these systems, right? The neutrality of economics, the neutrality of markets, the neutrality of computation, which is why it continues to be the kind of, the go-to in this attempt to resolve what is seen as kind of inherently human flaws, right? And they say if we can only build the right economic model, if we can only build the right computational model, then we can solve the problem of all the unfairnesses of the world.
I've got something on this, Jaya, just to jump in. A while ago at the salon, we talked about really interesting kind of computational social science paper called Algorithmic Realism, which was kind of really attacking this kind of systems paradigm of computational building, and saying that we need to escape this kind of limited, overly formal algorithmic thinking. I've got some slides. Let me jump to them.
I mean, what I find interesting is that there is what is, I think, powerful in this narrative is that there's a kind of dual element to it. There is the claim of, there's a deterministic claim where it's like we can use markets to achieve certain specific outcomes, right? And then there's a generative claim as well, which is like the kind of the automata, right? This idea of like complex behavior emerging out of simple rules, which is like almost a kind of evolutionary claim, right? And the two of those together somehow provide like for a really powerful ideological propeller or propellant. And you add to that the promise of returns, and then you're off. Let's see, what did you bring up? What slide?
This is about algorithmic formalism. So just this is a trap, like a kind of a conceptual trap that I think a lot of people that work with computational systems, whether by designing them or implementing them, seem to fall into. And it's just one of those blind spots you notice again and again if you hang out with computer scientists, that they're so enchanted with the tools and the resources and the infrastructure and the machinery they have, that they can't help themselves but produce representations, models of the universe. But then the danger is you don't pay heed to that gap, that epistemic gap between models and between reality. And so, that's the idea of formalism, where we think our system represents the world. I remember after Anna Singh's book, Mushroom at the End of the World, Tega Brain, artist and technologist, wrote a great short piece called The Environment is Not a System, which is like calling this out in the natural context. So formalism is getting attacked from all sides, and rightly so.
Yeah, but formalism, it's useful and it's operational, and that's why it keeps being around, right?
It's useful if you're pragmatic about it, of course. But that's the problem. We lose the pragmatism because of the ideology and the incentives.
Exactly. But I think what's interesting is when you then see kind of new token economic engineers and designers, it really is like you see it, there is a form of world building in the creation of these new formal structures, right? Where it's like you can see the excitement at generating yet another, these snow bubbles, these kind of little like enclosed worlds. And that's how I picture it in my head always. That's the mental model. Is that what it's called? The snow bubble? Is that what it's called?
Snow globe, I think.
Snow globe, yeah. And then it's like you have all these little agents inside that behave in certain predetermined ways, and they produce all these amazing glittery effects, and then you can kind of shake it and you can see what happens. And and that's really what I see happening in a lot of the economic experimentation that's taking place.
This is even like we talk about Homo economicus, this idea that you have like little kind of rational agents that are kind of like little deterministic machines being nudged around through the incentives that you create. This is actually one step further, and if you'll permit me to make a wordplay, I call this Homo blockonomicus, where we think that these things are like not only are they deterministic and they're on rails, but we can also enclose them in a hermetically sealed environment. And that's kind of that's guarded by the validation and the thermodynamics of the blockchain network.
Yeah, and then you add gaming to that because there's a certain game element. It's like, well, welcome to my globe. Play around in this kind of like in this fictitious environment, and you might get rich.
But why are the games? Why is it always Hunger Games? Why is it always Rain Man? Like why are we always playing these zero-sum games? This kind of like feast or famine games.
Yeah. Do you have a specific direction you want to go in? Otherwise, maybe you could go.
I think maybe the peer-to-peer open source part is nice for us to jump to. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay.
We talk about history. I think that's a nice place to kind of anchor it in the. Past.
Yes.
The way back to the top. This is it. Yes.
I would love to get to my perpetual motion machine at some point too.
Yes, we'll get there. So
okay.
Shall I say something about how we framed this conversation initially, and then maybe that'll help us. Yeah. So what we were thinking of was we have in the past the kind of open source free software movements, which were to try and make to increase the access of, this is pre-digital scarcity. This is just software on the internet, infinitely replicable bits and bytes. But everything was locked down in the paradigm of intellectual property. So there was a big movement, mostly in the States, but it was, to some extent global, in the latter part of the 20th century, which was driving towards these goals, a bit like the goal of decentralization, the poetic ideal of decentralization, the poetic ideal of free software, and basically kind of rallying against digital property rights and the enclosure of, wouldn't even call it commons, but digital, the industry being built upon digital software. And so that was kind of widely thought of as the open source software movement. Part of that, I guess you could say, was there were a whole bunch of what we call peer-to-peer, P2P kinds of protocols and applications. And we probably, almost everyone in this call has probably touched one of these or knows people that have touched them at some point. So you can think of things like Napster, if you're as old as I am, sharing MP3s on SoulSeek and Napster in the late 90s. Things like torrents, the BitTorrent protocol, for example. Not so long ago, I heard a statistic that torrents were responsible for about 30% of unencrypted web traffic. So that is peer-to-peer is still pushing packets around the internet of today, and it's still important. But where we are today, almost nobody talks about peer-to-peer and open source in a pure sense. Everyone usually talks about them with relation to blockchains or other kinds of incentivized applied cryptographic methods. So what we thought was an interesting kind of jumping off point for this conversation is kind of, why did we end up with this blockchain future and not so much this kind of peer-to-peer future? Why have we ended up with Homo blockonomicus, where everyone's incentivized, is getting nudged around by tokens, instead of this kind of idea of altruistically building mutual infrastructure?
Yeah. I find that to be a super fascinating question. The way that I tend to think through this, or let's say a piece that I've been trying to work through a little bit in my head, is the kind of exactly the differences from the perspective of when it comes to property and property rights, right? So when we look at the kind of early histories of open source and the idea of open knowledge, it was very much based on this idea that when it comes to knowledge, knowledge is not scarce, meaning if I have some knowledge, it doesn't mean that you can't, or it doesn't mean that if I give it to you, I lose it. In fact, if I share it with you, we're likely to generate even more knowledge and even better knowledge. And so, there was this idea of, both when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to code, and now increasingly also when it comes to data, the idea is sharing is better and it's better for everybody. And when you share it, nobody else loses out. In fact, everybody wins. And so it's interesting to kind of go from those early days, and then, all of a sudden find ourselves in a situation where there is, in fact, the kind of attempt to reimpose scarcity and reimpose property rights into the digital, and not from kind of the top down, but from the bottom up, as a kind of as a new revolutionary movement or something online. And that is super curious. And to me, it's an open question mark whether that represents some form of kind of capture, by kind of, the capitalist and financial imaginary, or whether that also to some degree represents a certain kind of admission from the open source software community that even though knowledge is free, its production and its creation, in fact, does require labor, and that labor does need to be sustained and remunerated. And it needs to be sustained and remunerated in the context that is capitalist and where you do need money in order to survive. And so, it's likely that it's somewhat of a mix of the two.
I just realized we're using the word free as in free software, but there's more than one meaning of free. So we should probably just disambiguate a little bit.
Where did I use the word free?
No, not you, but on this slide, it says free software, because we're talking about there's the open source movement and there's the free software movement. And so there's the notion of free as in speech, and there's the notion of free as in beer. And this is like the way the Bitcoiners explain it. And so like when we can speak freely, it doesn't mean that our actions are without cost. It means that there's no restrictions on our behaviors. And that's kind of what the free software movement is talking about here, that the software is not encumbered by legal restrictions.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a good starting off point to also trace back some of the histories of peer-to-peer that you already did with the mention of Napster and so on, and of torrenting specifically. But, you know, peer-to-peer technologies, I mean, once again, peer-to-peer, you know, very strong relationship to the concept of decentralization. It's an attempt to kind of instantiate decentralization into a kind of technical architecture, into a protocol architecture. But what is really the aim here, right? What is really the benefits of peer-to-peer technologies? And that's kind of where things, you know, start to get a little bit muddled. Like, in many ways, you know, the biggest kind of argument for peer-to-peer and for decentralization is this idea of resilience. You know, the biggest argument for decentralization at a technical level anyway is this idea of resilience. You know, if one of the nodes get taken out, the rest of the nodes can continue to operate as they're intended to. The other kind of side effect of that is also not just resilience, but also circumvention, right? And that means circumvention of, you know, anything from natural disaster to law enforcement. And that was very important in the kind of, you know, the piracy and the BitTorrent movement. And, you know, the kind of, let's say, the storyline behind that was exactly kind of sharing of knowledge, sharing of culture, as being for the benefit of humanity overall. And then the other argument for peer-to-peer is this idea of self-determination, right? Is that if you can run your own infrastructure, you're not at the mercy of someone else running your infrastructure and therefore being able to shut it down. And so all of these kind of ideas of around peer-to-peer keep resurfacing. But there's a lot of like lessons that, again, I think are worth learning, that seem to kind of continuously be forgotten, which includes things like, you know, not everyone is going to want to run their own infrastructure and is going to want to run their own, you know, server. And also, you know, circumvention, you know, can be a good thing and a bad thing, depending on like what the kind of use case is. You might be pro piracy, but not pro tax evasion, for example. And then the question of resilience, like what we see, and I think this is important for people to start to recognize who are involved in decentralized infrastructures as well, is that what we see is that it's not always more resilient, because the complexity that comes with decentralized ecosystems, and now I'm talking definitely of the kind of blockchain ecosystems that we're seeing today, is such that, you know, your let's say your chain, your blockchain that you're running, you know, with some very specific utility, might entirely depend on some bridge that a whole other set of people are running in order for you to actually interoperate with a kind of, you know, super important core component. And so, you know, in terms of resilience, like decentralization as a core value in an ecosystem sometimes just brings about more complexity and in fact more vulnerabilities for that very reason.
Yeah, just to jump in there, Jaya, that you know, where we're ending is a really you know, powerful point. And when I was looking up, there's a slide which we can get to a bit later about cathedrals and bazaars and open source software. When I was looking up a review of that, just to recap my memory, somebody mentioned Heartbleed, which was, you know, massive you know, internet security you know, shit show. That basically happened because there was like a small piece of open source software that was being maintained by a completely forgotten, you know, kind of bedroom programmer. And in the end, I don't remember the exact, you probably remember better than I do, Jaya. In the end, they stopped maintaining it. And then, like, you know, also somebody took over the package management rights and then inserted malware into almost every piece of software on the internet.
Yep.
So, and the other thing I thought was interesting is, so we were talking about the desire to run infrastructure if you've got these complicated technical systems like blockchain nodes and protocols, but I think it goes beyond desire. There's also capability. And like, you know, so the capability in terms of having the right technical equipment to do X, Y, and Z, and also the kind of the know-how, and also like the infrastructure, internet connectivity, and all the rest of it. So these things are already being privileged and biased towards people that have, you know, before we even begin.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember
we're agreeing way too much in this dissensus talk.
Yeah, maybe we have to find something more controversial. So we go to your perpetual promise machine.
Yeah, let's go to the perpetual promise machine, and then maybe we can wrap up with some final case studies, and people can actually chip in with some questions. No. So what was it trying to get at with this perpetual promise machine? This is my visualization of finance and what it means, what that radical shift has entailed, going from kind of early days decentralization and peer-to-peer to now, adopting tokens that then, integrate the powers and the dynamics of finance deep into the kind of protocols. And really deep into the protocols. They become like the kind of very source of promises around, information security and so on and so forth, and governance of the protocols themselves. So what does the integration of tokens actually mean for these technical systems? And another way to put it is, what happened to, or, what does that kind of transition from the early days of open source software to a kind of like token driven open source software community actually mean, or why did that happen? So, finance, finance at its core is a bet on the future, right? Or a promise of the future. It's the kind of creation of value in the present on the basis of some future, the idea of some future value being created. And so what that actually does is it harnesses an incredible amount of energy and imagination, around all the possibilities that the future might in fact entail. And that includes promises of wild returns. And the added benefit here is that there's no fixed deadline to actually deliver. And what I mean by that is not kind of on an individual case-by-case basis or an individual project-by-project basis, but the blockchain industry as a whole. And so what we've seen in the blockchain industry is this kind of continuous perpetual movement of like, can you go to the next slide, Wassim?
Sure. I just wanted to come in with a hot take, which is I call this blockchain first, ask questions later.
Yeah, right. So what this entails is this kind of perpetual movement where, the story of decentralization, the convincing story of kind of what the blockchain can achieve, mobilizes or bootstraps the kind of financing. So everyone kind of believes in this kind of story. They buy into the tokens that are going to achieve this decentralization. That financing actually enables the building of tech. And so the open source software community is super happy because finally they actually get paid to build open source software. The actual tech produces, real effects. You look closer at those effects and they don't actually match the original story, right? So what we see is like, decentralization maybe sometimes, but not really always, all the kind of social benefits that are supposed to happen, maybe sometimes, but not always. But at the end of the day, nobody looks too closely at that, except for the kind of niche, critics that are hammering at the kind of blockchain system over and over again. But generally speaking, the blockchain industry as a whole doesn't look too closely at that as long as there's returns, right? And those returns justify the bigger story. And so the narrative continues. So, okay, you build out, blockchain at the protocol layer, then you build layer 1, then you build layer 2.
I have a question, Jaya. Let's try to like at least performatively disagree. And so like I'm going to take the position of somebody that is pro blockchain for the next 30 seconds. And so if is that specific to the blockchain space, or is this more like a feature of capitalist incentives? What do you think makes it worse or more pronounced or unique in the blockchain space?
It's not worse or more pronounced in the blockchain space. It is absolutely a feature of finance and financial capitalism. What it does in the blockchain space is, finance just becomes, or financial speculation just becomes that engine, right? It's the harnessing of the future promises, the harnessing of the imagination. And in this case, the imagination and the future promises is exactly the story of decentralization, right? And that story is so beautiful and it's so convincing that is a kind of narrative that just keeps being kind of recycled over and over again. So then let's, if we look at the actual effects, and this is where like, I think it's wonderful that we have really strong blockchain critics out there. They're very critical voices. But they also don't look at some of the, my take is much more kind of muddled than that, much more nuanced. So let's say, I think there's some interesting things that come out of blockchain systems and some deeply kind of fucked up things.
It's lonely out here in the middle, isn't it, Jaya?
Huh? It is lonely out here in the middle. And so this is what I'm trying to kind of get at with this crazy image. I've used your kind of AI generated image here, where it's like, I mean, yes, we get kind of scams, we get mining farms, we get e-waste, but we also get new internationalisms, right? We get kind of communities of software developers and token speculators and whatever from all over the world uniting on, chats and producing some kind of shared meaning about the world. Which at the current time I find to be very valuable, because right now we are actually headed for a direction with the, where you see kind of lockdowns of and kind of tendencies towards nationalisms instead. So and then we also get the newly rich, and we get the newly wrecked, and we get new aesthetics, and we get economic experimentation and governance experimentation. So the actual effects of this kind of weird perpetual machine is far more complex and weird than the narrative and the storyline. Contains all the crazy stuff that critics like to point out, and the madness that we've seen in the markets lately, and much more than that, But
so it's everything. It's everything to everyone, isn't it, Jaya? I call it a tabula rasa because I think people project what they want onto it, what they are preoccupied with onto it.
People do project what they want onto it, but I think I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is, for anyone who's interested in studying these systems, you have to go beyond the storyline. You have to go beyond the kind of hot takes, the kind of short, the
spectacle.
Like, you can't just say like, oh yes, I'm now going to talk about this DAO, which is decentralized, and they do this and this and this. And it's like, well, is it really? And do they really? And is that really what's going on? I mean, it's so important to kind of like try and take those extra steps, also because all the incentives will be against you for doing that. Like all the incentives will be there for you to buy into that system, to promote it, because maybe you've bought some tokens to try and participate, and once you have tokens, you're participating, then you're invested. You've got skin in the game, and then you really want the story to be true. And which then means that even when you get wrecked, you're still going to say it's true.
I was in Malta over the winter doing some research for my book, and I met up with an old friend from my music days who I used to work with over there, and he found cryptocurrencies, and he's like, he's very careful, and he's just like kind of dabbling, but he said to me like very earnestly, but Wassim, I'm only investing in the ones that I believe in. And I was like, bless you, my friend, but the belief is probably the kind of, it's the thing we hold on to the most, but it's also like very often the architect of our downfall.
Well, but this is I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is exactly the feature of financial capitalism. This is exactly the engine, the kind of perpetual motion machine, is the belief, and the fact that the belief has no deadline, right? There's no kind of point at which you're like, oh, okay, well, it turned out to not be true.
I feel like we've got external I feel like we've got an external deadline, which is like the oceans boiling.
Exactly.
We have a few slides about that. Do you want to talk about that?
We could do, and I feel like we're also coming up to maybe our talking deadline, and we might want to open up.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe let's flip to the question of carbon, and then we can see where the audience would like us to go.
Yep.
So here we go. So yeah, I don't want to go into like what is a blockchain and how the mining works. It's kind of like a lottery. You can think of it like a lottery, and people are doing these kinds of repetitive cycles of computation on purpose-built specialized hardware, and each cycle of computation on one of these computers is a lottery ticket, and the network decides what the probability of success is, and each page of the ledger of a blockchain, in this case Bitcoin, gives out a set amount of reward to the miners for doing all of this work. So coming back to the paperclip maximizer that we were talking about at the start, proof of work is universal paperclips. This is like, because of the way the system is architected, both the incentives and this kind of adjustment of the probabilities to keep the blocks coming at a constant rate in proof of work, there basically is no satiety. the Bitcoin will never have enough energy. And also currently Ethereum and other proof of work networks, but really Bitcoin is the elephant in the room here. Jai, do you want to say something?
I think you said. I think you said it all. I mean,
all right.
that's
So,
like.
so I'll just escalate then.
Escalate.
So I mean, I see Bitcoin as an inhuman monetary system. This thing doesn't care about us or life; just wants energy, and like that kind of puts us in this zero-sum game that we're kind of as the living things on Earth are competing with Bitcoin for the harvested sunlight that reaches the Earth, and we're not very good at harvesting this yet. And that is, possibly an existential problem for us because the incentives are such that a lot of energy suppliers are looking at how can I put this? The incentives are such that they outcompete things like residential energy use, and that's why you see the Bitcoin miners kind of go from place to place looking for energy. And where we are in this kind of planetary moment, we all see these reports from the IPCC. It looks like quite dire news. So having this kind of extremely energy intensive, rapacious network that is kind of growing unchecked in terms of its energy appetite, that is a potential problem for us as living things on this planet. And here's a graph of the Bitcoin hash rate, which is indirect measure of the amount of computational resource, the amount of energy and computational cycles going into this proof of work, which kind of undergirds this entire security of Bitcoin, and like people knowing that the number of coins they have today will be the same that they have tomorrow, as any kind of monetary or kind of value tradable commodity asset needs to have that kind of certainty. And so this graph is just like wild ride. It's not even the start of the Bitcoin network on the left. This is halfway through 2015, and you can see it's mostly going up. It actually goes up even faster than the price, one of the only things that does that. But I think what's also interesting in terms of connecting this kind of desire for energy to kind of real world consequences, take a look at the pictures on the slide. So they are of like these mining farms, these kind of like data centers full of these mining machines getting flooded and catching on fire because they tend to Bitcoin wants the cheapest energy, wants the most energy and at the cheapest rate. That's where kind of the economics and the incentives kind of guide everything. So that usually ends up in places with like kind of hydro dams or like a stranded illiquid energy far away from population centers where it can't get easily transmitted to places where it's used. And so, Bitcoin kind of flows down these contours towards the cheapest energy, unless nation states, the rules of law and men, put kind of barriers in its way. And on the bottom right, and indeed the kind of these three kind of red boxes here are fluctuations due to kind of either seasonal moves over the planetary surface as the weather changes and the energy prices change, reflecting that. And on the right, the big drop was when China basically not quite outlawed Bitcoin mining, but kind of told the miners that they had to leave or made it much more difficult for them. So those are all empty kind of infrastructures that were previously used as mining farms. I think that looks like it's in the interior desert in the west of China. So these are kind of pictures of the real externalities of global consensus of using a blockchain and proof of work.
But to tie that back a little bit to some of the stuff we were saying earlier, like the inhuman monetary system, the inhuman aspect of the kind of blockchain consensus algorithm is in fact the very point of it. Like it's part of the kind of ideology or part of the kind of thinking that if we can anchor human consensus, and in the case of Bitcoin specifically, the question of value in something that is non-human, in something that is external from a human, i.e. the laws of nature and the laws of maths, then we can arrive at a system that is more neutral and is somehow tied to some kind of laws that are external to the kind of to the more, let's say, suspicious laws of human relations, the kind of the the human relations that are prone to become corrupt, let's say, due to the selfish nature of individuals. So, that's the kind of ideological story behind it.
We haven't used the T word, Jaya. We've almost finished. We haven't used that short 5-letter T word, which I think it's all about. Yeah, it's all about trust. And so like things like Bitcoin tried to replace kind of the trust that what we form in our kind of like, in our social networks, let's say, with this kind of like, machine process, this proof of work process. So that, I mean, I've heard some people I used to work with at the MIT Media Lab describe Bitcoin as the currency of enemies. So you don't need to trust the people. You just, because Bitcoin's got your back. Bitcoin's doing all of this work. It's this kind of like heavy machinery, which is very expensive for us to operate and run. But the benefit of that is that you don't need to trust anybody. But then I would ask ourselves, like, what kind of world do we want to live in, where we don't want to trust anybody? And that informs you about the. Oh, go ahead.
I would go further than that and
Yeah.
say that it's a total lie. It's like a piece of bollocks. Like, I don't know, for me, I find it very interesting to like trace through a little bit these very social concepts, these ideas around trust, and then like how it means different things when you're talking about a computational network, and then when you're talking about any interaction with that computational network. So one thing is like for the protocol itself to be, trustless according to very specific and very precisely defined information security parameters. Another thing is to claim that people's use of this system is therefore trustless, or that the value of Bitcoin is in any way trustless. It comes down to kind of like how powerful the story is. Again, it's like, okay, the idea is a little bit that because the supply of Bitcoin is limited and it's determined purely by a protocol, therefore the value won't be down to a kind of a potentially corrupt central bank, depending on how they set interest rates or how much money they're printing, right? It's going to be instead anchored in something that is outside of the human, something objective. But then of course you look at the actual value of Bitcoin in the markets, and it's absolutely and entirely down to human relations, and it's entirely down to how much people are willing to buy a Bitcoin for, and so like there is this, the realities continuously contradict the underlying story. And we see this especially also when it comes to the concept of trust. It's like one thing is to say that, trust, some kind of trustlessness is achieved in a certain kind of information security parameters. But then when it comes to by far most people's interactions with Bitcoin systems entails a lot of trust. It entails trust in the websites where you're looking at the value of Bitcoin and how much you might actually want to buy. It comes down to the trust in the exchanges that you're buying from, the wallet developers, who you meet in some dark alley exchanging some hardware wallet with, or whatever else. Like there's no pure trustless engagement with the actual system itself.
I wonder, Jaya, if like
that's why you see so many scams, right? That's why you see so many people getting scammed.
Yeah.
Because it just doesn't work that way.
I was also thinking, just while you were talking, about the kind of the adulation, the kind of like deification of the developers in Bitcoin, is also perhaps a consequence partially of this, like, dearth of trust or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a slide that was talking about some other use cases. What do we want to get?
Yeah, sure. Let's finish there. Yeah, where are we?
So we've been doing there's been a lot of dissensus in this talk around all the claims around decentralization and so on, but there is also a lot of very quite interesting experimentation happening in the field. So, Bitcoin proof of work is just one protocol. But Wassim, do you want to talk through a little bit some of these examples that we brought up?
Sure. Yeah. Why don't I'll do the arts and the financial ones, and you can do the humanitarian one. So Black Swan DAO is a project actually it's kind of partially based out of Trust, where I am, and it's using DAO logics, if not the architecture of blockchains themselves, but using the way that they work to try and do two things, which is try and find more kind of egalitarian way to distribute creative funding, and also to find ways to facilitate serendipity of creative working and collaboration. And the Culture Stake is out further field, based in London, and it's doing a similar thing. So these are both kind of arts, token-inspired systems. I think Culture Stake may be literally kind of blockchain-based, whereas Black Swan is kind of using the logics, the mechanistics of blockchains. In terms of the financial, I mean, the first two examples are really fun, so I should definitely cover those. So you might have heard about these, everyone. So Constitution DAO was when a group of well-meaning crypto fans decided they wanted to buy an original copy of the American Constitution. Unfortunately, by doing this fundraising kind of in public on the Ethereum blockchain, everybody knew how much money they had. So the guy, what's his name? Is it Keith Griffin, the Citadel Securities guy, the guy that does the front running on Robinhood, the payment for order flow? He kind of steals people's lunch money on Robinhood for a living. He outbid them by $1, which I think is very interesting. And then Spice DAO was, maybe you all know about the sci-fi story and film Dune. So there was originally a cinema project which never was realized by Alejandro Jodorowsky, which, with the Mobius, the graphic novelist, they produced this massive kind of graphic novel, which was the storyboard for the film they wanted to make, which was never made. And so these people got together, made Spice DAO to buy one of these books, and they did it. They paid 100 times the reserve price at auction. And then they realized they didn't have the rights to make the movie like they thought. So there's an interesting kind of point there about, like, again, intellectual property and enclosure, but kind of like a weird inside out thing that these people had their kind of, up from down, I guess, like scrambled from doing too much of this kind of like DeFi, degen, Ethereum stuff. And then Maker is a stable coin, or like MakerDAO is a DAO, a decentralized organization that administers a stable coin, kind of a crypto dollar. And Gnosis DAO is a company, it used to be a kind of financial services company that is turning into a DAO. So there's many kind of like, I just wanted to give like a spectrum of kind of the different kinds of reasons, bases, and starting points for different groups to kind of come together and do kind of fundraising and allocating treasuries. And then, do you want to cover the humanitarian ones? I guess you must know about Assange DAO and Ukraine DAO a little bit, Jaya.
Yeah, a little bit. So yeah, the Assange DAO was started to raise funds to try and get Julian Assange, one of the founders of WikiLeaks, out of prison, where he's been for a very long time now in the UK, and to prevent him from being extradited to the United States. And the Assange DAO, the way that it worked, as far as I can remember, was something along the lines of the DAO raised, I think, about $56 million worth of Ethereum
at the time.
At the time, the Ethereum value at the time, which was used to buy an NFT created in collaboration between Julian Assange and an NFT artist called Pac. An NFT is a clock that basically counts, how long time Julian has been in prison for. And then that NFT, and then the funds that went to the NFT was then going to go to provide for his legal counsel and to try and get him out. So that was kind of how that worked. And they managed to raise a lot of money, but they have not managed to get Julian Assange out of detention so far. The Ukraine DAO, I can't remember the specifics around that, but again, it was a kind of call out for donations for the people of Ukraine during wartime.
There was no token initially. It was just meant to be like straight up donation. And
Yeah.
then after a while, they were like, oh, maybe we'll airdrop everyone an NFT later. And then there was this weird stampede where everyone was like, NFT, oh, that might be worth something. So then the Ukraine DAO turned into this kind of speculative vehicle. And then, this is the government of Ukraine essentially was kind of doing this messaging. They were like, oh, no, we're not doing an NFT now. And so they were kind of like, it was crazy because obviously Ukraine is kind of, the government there is in a pressing situation, and they were trying to work out ways that they could do X, Y, and Z. And a lot of funds flowed through there.
Yeah, but it's kind of, I think what's interesting about these examples is exactly, because there's plenty of ways that you could do fundraising, right? I mean, there's plenty of ways where you could be like, well, can you please give some money to this cause? But there's something about the imagination around tokens and NFTs, where the possibility of a speculative value means that the willingness to donate is just that much higher. And that's a little bit where, I kind of wanted to get back to that kind of like the perpetual motion machine of like, it is the potential of some future value that generates so much power in the present. And which means that you get everybody kind of jumping on board, right? Whether it's the Ukrainian government or activists trying to support Julian Assange, or open source software developers, or well-meaning kind of arts collectives. It's kind of, there's a certain power that comes with the decentralization of the affordances of financial capitalism.
But let's just say, like on the other side as well, because you can't stop anyone from participating and using this stuff, it means that anyone can use it. So like North Korea and the Lazarus hacking group is reputed to be part of North Korean state apparatus, and they're hacking crypto exchanges left, right, and center. I mean, their country is sanctioned, embargoed, so this is maybe one of the only ways that capital goes in. And I remember also in 18 and 19, I was writing about stable coins. And I found, and I'd like to see if they were the answer to Bitcoin's volatility in the down market. And I found a clip from the Sun newspaper, which was, the story was something like, ISIS treasury decimated as Bitcoin collapses in value. And then, of course, ISIS doesn't have bank accounts, so they have to use things like Bitcoin. And so you can't stop anyone using it. It's literally the currency of enemies.
Are there any questions or any specific points people would like us to elaborate on? Because I know we've actually covered like a lot of very diverging territory. I mean, we've gone from proof of work to proof of stake to imaginaries and you name it.
So you meant, like, while we wait for some things to come in, I was kind of, I'm from art and ecology, so I'm tied into the heating of the planet and all this computer systems and stuff like that. And I was wondering if you could tell us of some, not just funny DAOs that have this ridiculous logics, but like ecological DAOs that are actually functioning, working.
Great call. Yeah, in fact, that's a bit of we should have mentioned something a bit more like that. Jaya, how much do you know about Klima?
Not enough, to be honest.
All right, I'll do a little bit. Yeah, so there's this thing called Klima DAO, Klima DAO. And the idea was to use, so basically, let's just say the quiet part out loud. A lot of these kind of, especially blockchain systems, end up at best as pyramid schemes, rewarding the early adopters and the insiders, at worst, literal Ponzi's. And so there is now this kind of new movement of decentralized finance being built on top of Ethereum, which is kind of like weaponizing these kind of like building modular pyramids and Ponzi's, weaponizing all of that. And so KlimaDAO is a fork of a well-known Ponzinomic DeFi protocol called Olympus or Ohm. So they wanted to apply this Ponzinomic drive, this economic drive, to the carbon credits market. It all sounds like this very kind of crazy experiment, but it had such an outsized effect at one point that it was in all of the Bloomberg, everywhere on the global news, because they had distorted the carbon credit market a huge amount. They wanted to drive the price up of carbon credits to make it to make it more costly for emitters to offset. But when you push the price of things up on the market, that doesn't necessarily mean that carbon is being sequestered or retired. It just means that more people issue credits for carbon that was already burnt or things like that. So there's huge amounts of unintended consequences, at least in the financial sphere, and we don't even know what the ecological consequences necessarily of that are. There's a lot of work going on in this eco space. There's a thing called the Toucan as well, like the bird TOUCAN protocol. And there's a thing called Vera, I think it's called Vera, which is kind of trying to do the certification or the validation of matching the credits to the sources that are retiring carbon. And as you could probably imagine, the verification systems of the carbon market are very much from the old world. And so we have to ask ourselves questions like, how can we, or can we even trust, or how can we do this well, bringing information that's been certified outside the blockchain into it and being sure of its veracity. And that's called the Oracle problem. It's kind of like a general problem with blockchains. We don't know if the information we're accessing, we can trust that if it's coming from some random sensor or some random source on the web or somewhere else.
I mean, the other obvious question to ask is whether carbon credits are even worth reviving as a kind of an effort to address the climate crisis. I mean, it didn't seem like they were working out. And then now with the kind of these Web3 efforts to kind of revive the market.
It seems like Capital's answer, like Capital's kind of like, oh, you want to save the planet? Well, what if we make another market to trade your stuff?
Another question might be about incentives generally. So it seemed like incentives seem to be driving these emerging technologies, and all of us and the planet and the cosmos kind of like off the ledge. So obviously very, very embedded, but what are the kind of like speculative imaginaries of reimagining the incentives?
What are the speculative imaginaries of reimagining?
I think we're kind of getting at the kind of post-capitalist possibilities here, right? Is that where we're going, Joel?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is probably, again, there's not too much dissensus here, I think, between myself and Jaya. I'm really frustrated by the lack of imagination that I see in the space. Like, I feel like we've got these kind of, at the very worst, blockchains are kind of like Lego block, Lego systems that we can build, models of the universe, economic, political, technological ones. We could be building them any way we can imagine, but instead we just keep building scarcity-based systems that reward the insiders, and we see these kind of like the pyramids and the Ponzi's. So there's a big question about, can we imagine, alternative modes? And there are ways to discourage or disincentivize speculation with, like, tokens or with whatever asset. There's an interesting paper going around at the moment co-written by Vitalik Buterin, the co-founder of Ethereum, talking about this concept of soul-bound tokens. And I don't know if you've come across this or thought about it too much, Jaya. It's this idea that it's kind of an untransferable token. It's kind of specific to you. It could be your university degree, could be an NFT which you can't transfer. And then the problem with that, I guess, is like everyone always loses their keys to their crypto wallets. So we have this phrase in the Bitcoin space, which is not your keys, not your coins. If you don't own the coins, if you haven't custodied them yourself, if they're on Coinbase or some website, you don't own them. So what happens if it's your soul? Like, not your keys, not your soul sounds a bit brutal to me.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Vitalik and some parts of the Ethereum space seem kind of determined to try and anchor some real world identity and fix some real world identity in the digital space, which I'm just all entirely against. It sounds like a total recipe for disaster and the worst form of totalitarianism you can imagine. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to incentives, like I think there's this kind of like, there's something strange about the word that I'm trying to kind of unpack also, which has to do with like, there is like in the term incentive, there's some kind of implicit understanding of the need to control people en masse, right? And a mistrust in people's ability to behave in any kind of sensible way if we don't create some kind of mass systems of control and coordination. And then, from the kind of that very common and but somehow invisible assumption that that's the nature of human behavior, the problem then becomes like, okay, so how can we design, a non-violent, non-centralized, non-authoritarian means for total control of human behavior en masse at scale, for the good of everybody, of course, right? And then you have these new dreams of algorithmic controls that incorporate market incentives with protocols, all operating very neutrally, of course, all operating in a very decentralized manner, of course, and all being voluntary and non-violent, of course, but including your real world identity with, economic consequences if you don't behave properly. So like there's a lot going on there.
Did you just say blockchain-based social credit system, Jaya?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's the thing. These architectures, like, it's interesting because the architecture of the blockchain, when you tie it with proof of work, with this kind of like leaderless, permissionless system, like it looks like a kind of, you're pushing towards freedom. But if you also then use the blockchain architecture in a kind of in a system with authorities, then we could end up with panopticons or like, really kind of like Orwellian surveillance states. The blockchain is a permanent ledger. That's kind of the idea. So if you're kind of a little agent in this network and every little action that you're taking is being recorded, then you're living in that surveillance dystopia that we're all so afraid of in the outside world.
But yeah, speaking of, also, if we go back to the kind of ecological breakdown scenario that we're very much living in right now, I still find it baffling that we're kind of storming headlong in a direction of increasing digitization, meaning increasing reliance on very complex computational hardware that demand a lot of electricity. At the same time as we're moving towards in a direction where like global supply chains are actually not going to be very stable, and the ability to reproduce these systems, and therefore the kind of like social structures that we're building into these systems is like very uncertain. Yeah, I find that kind of strange. I find it strange that we live in this kind of historical moment and our imagination of what the future of technology looks like still is more data, more digitization, more things online, rather than looking for a kind of broader spectrum of what a technological development pathway might look like. That might mean, less digitization, less data instead, and machines that actually work under conditions of climate breakdown.
Or even just judicious application of technology, and not just like going for the maximum amount of technology as the kind of default option.
Yep. Yeah. I feel like everybody's a bit kind of maybe bamboozled or chilling behind their screens, or not, it's a shame that we're not everybody in a room in person. I find these kinds of conversations are always better like that. So, but I hope everyone's found the discussion interesting nonetheless.
You can feel free to turn on your cameras if you want as well, just so it feels like they're chatting with somebody.
I just finished a semester of teaching in China, and like I have to say that, even with the instructor screaming at the students, they would never turn their cameras or microphones on. So I think actually, even with just a couple of bright boxes on the Zoom matrix, it's an improvement on that.
I've got a question, but it's sort of like, so I'm trying to figure out how to like turn it into a question. But I'm wondering about like blockchain and how it sort of like hopes to recreate structures that kind of already exist, and whether there are sort of like issues that have arisen out of, I guess, problems within living in like sort of digital framework that blockchain might solve for new issues. Maybe I'll just give the example that might make it a bit easier. But I'm sort of thinking through like the issue with dance being stolen and sold in video games, and how intellectual property right laws don't, sorry, what am I trying to say? Like short phrases aren't considered intellectual property because they're too short, whereas in the digital space, they are a product that can be sold. So I'm sort of thinking through and looking at where the laws don't cater to that, but this new digital framework is creating a commodity out of these things, and whether blockchain can solve these issues. But it was interesting, like listening to your talk, because I've been thinking about it, I guess, within that sort of like narrative of the decentralizing blockchain is going to fix everything. Sorry, I kind of don't really know what the question is.
I feel like there's something interesting in there, like, because we were talking about enclosure earlier, how we can use like blockchains and these networks to kind of enclose information so it can be extracted and for value, for capital. What you're talking about almost sounds a bit like kind of a temporal window of enclosure, so that kind of in the kind of digital space writ large, these short clips are considered like fair game or whatever, fair use. But in the blockchain milieu, the value is able to be captured on these kind of like short time slices. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of us talk about blockchains as time machines, but that's actually an interesting new angle. I never thought of them as kind of ways of extracting time. Well, it's a different way of extracting value from time, I suppose.
Yeah, or I guess even like that sort of thing where like yeah, I'm sort of wondering, like, is it, I guess, sort of like, is it this sort of like turning to blockchain as a potential solution? Is it giving up on a sort of real world structure, like when you were talking about oh, sorry, completely lost. But yeah, like sort of giving up on the real world.
I think 2 weeks ago in my talk on NFTs, there was an article in Palladium magazine, which was called When the Stagnation Goes Virtual, which is about an NFT conference that's actually taking place in New York again just now. And it was kind of this idea of everyone rushing in to own NFTs as assets, persistent assets in these new metaverses. That implied in that was this really kind of bleak strain of techno-nihilism, where people are kind of giving up on the IRL on the outside and kind of lurching towards these technologies. And I think it speaks to the point that Jaya was just making earlier. This is just like more tech, and we're moving more towards this kind of like post-human accelerationist future.
Yeah, or so yeah, it was the like, I guess thinking about like whether like a centralization is something that's useful, like is actually like trying to go back and instead of make a new legal framework, is it more about trying to change the laws that are already existing in a centralized form? But yeah.
So you might not believe this, but I'm an editor of a law journal. I know nothing about the law, but like the reason they're interested in, like, I guess this technology governance stuff around cryptocurrencies and blockchains, like, you know, Jai and I work on, is because it points towards, I think, possible futures of technology governance. You know, ones where the nation states know that they can't control everything, movement of, you know, information as well as capital as well as people, and so maybe it's more a case of like understand like the state learning which battles it can and can't fight, which hills the state can or can't die on.
Thank you.
I think there's a hand up.
Yep, Madeline.
Hiya. I'm very new to all of this stuff, so I was just wondering if you have any recommendations of books that, or like things you could read to like get your head around it a bit more, or if there's any, I don't know, like speculative fiction or sci-fi that references this stuff or might be interesting to read.
I will start with the recommendation, and it's something on Ignota Books called the Bitcoin White Paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, with a foreword by a person called Janna Klarre Bekker. And I think that's I actually lent it to somebody on my team. We're writing a play about Bitcoin right now, and I lent it to somebody on my team to familiarize themselves with the technology.
Excellent.
I'll write a few recommendations in the chat. There's also Artists Rethinking the Blockchain that some people at Furtherfield put out. That has a lot of good material in it as well. And then I think the Money Labs reader series is very good too. No, what do you think?
If you want sci-fi, Keith Stanley Robinson's last book, Ministry for the Future, has like a couple of different kind of blockchain related bits in it. There's a part where they want to make a Martian carbon currency, and there's another poem written from the perspective of blockchain.
Oh, cool. So that's in Sandy Robinson's latest book.
And Kim Stanley Robinson, Ministry for the Future. Yeah.
Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I think there was also this a bit older, but it was more about peer-to-peer. It was before blockchain, but this science fiction thrillers by a guy named Daniel Suarez.
Oh, Damon.
Damon, yeah, Damon Suarez.
I haven't read it, but a friend raves about it.
Yeah, it's not bad. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you have some more questions? I mean, the temperature, the temporality is, I think, really interesting kind of way. You also mentioned thermoeconomics at some point, and chrono chains, time chains, and things like that. Unfortunately, we don't really have loads of time to get, I think, into it. But
I mean, if people want additional reading, I have been writing about that stuff. So there's an article called Reminiscences of a Clock Operator, which is about like a philosophical angle on blockchain time. And there's an article in Weird Economies by one of Sahel's platform by Bahar Nurizad, one of Sahel's students, called Bitcoin Contingency, about the consequences of the indeterminacy of Bitcoin and how that leads to these kind of runaway environmental effects. What are you writing, Jaya? What's up? Like, shill your writings?
I wish I was writing more. I'm super busy with NIM these days, but there's 2 papers that I'm kind of in progress. One that is called Cryptographic Geographies, and it looks at how techniques from cryptography are influencing or kind of intersect with ideas around digital sovereignty today, and how those ideas around digital sovereignty are actually quite contradictory. So you get ideas of digital sovereignty as we see in the blockchain space that typically is very much based on the individual. And then you have the agendas of digital sovereignty that's very much the question of kind of nation state security and a nation kind of national agenda. And then you also have agendas of digital sovereignty that's coming from indigenous communities that relates to indigenous knowledge and indigenous understandings of nations. So the paper is kind of looking at how those different discourses intersect with different cryptographic techniques, and is an invitation to also to geographers specifically to look at cryptography and start to get their heads around cryptography, because these techniques are going to be defining for the battles around sovereignty that are yet to come.
I just remembered while you were talking, Jaya, that we have a residency program at the 0x Salon, and one of the residents that just finished wrote a nice article about decentralization, which I'm going to put in here. And she's coming from a kind of decolonial perspective, which I think is like quite needed in the Web3 blockchain space.
Cool.
Oh yeah. Madeline, do you have another question? No.
No,
Okay.
sorry. Thank you
Yeah,
for your
sorry.
answers.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, we're anyways at the top of the hour. Yeah.
Cool.
So I'd like
Thanks
to
very
say
much for
thank
having
you.
us, Joel. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for expanding our understanding and kind of pharmacon of digital blockchain technologies. Yeah, wow, incredible. My head is gonna take that in, and I've written down all of these readings, and I'm gonna catch up more. And thanks so much for what you're doing, and for speaking with us, and for being dissenting.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Jaya. Thanks, everybody. And yeah, hopefully catch you again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.